Welcome to the Book Voices channel. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest book discussions. Now let's dive into today's book.
All right, so you know those like big sales? Those ones that aren't just like, quick wins. The ones where you have to have multiple conversations and you're dealing with different people within an organization and a much bigger investment from the customer.
Yeah.
It's a whole different world from, just like selling a phone case at the checkout or
Oh, absolutely.
something like that, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just a single interaction and you get that immediate decision.
It's a completely different beast.
Mm.
And, the challenge is always figuring out, like, what really works in those situations.
Right, exactly. It's like, how do you get that deep understanding without getting lost in a mountain of information about, like, closing techniques and sales strategies?
Absolutely. And that's actually exactly what we're going to be focusing on in this deep dive today.
Perfect.
We're going to be exploring research-backed strategies that are specifically designed for succeeding in those larger, more complex sales, the ones that you're talking about.
Awesome.
And to make sure we're not just speculating or relying on anecdotes, this whole discussion is actually rooted in a very comprehensive study. It's an analysis of over 35,000 sales calls
Wow.
across 27 countries conducted over 12 years.
That's a lot of data.
It's a significant data set, and that's why I think it's particularly valuable for our conversation today.
Yeah, it's not just like one person's opinion or a few isolated experiences.
No, it's based on a really extensive observation of what's actually happening in the field.
Right. And what's fascinating is that right from the start, this research, which is all from a book called Spin Selling by Neil Rackham,
Yeah, classic.
it suggests that a lot of the traditional sales techniques that we might have learned, which are often geared towards those like quicker one-off sales, might not actually be so effective in these larger, more complex deals.
Yeah, that's a very consistent finding throughout their research.
In fact, they might even be holding us back.
Potentially, yeah.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really extract the core insights and the actionable takeaways from this really extensive research.
That's our goal.
So think of it as like a shortcut.
Exactly.
We're doing the heavy lifting, sifting through all that data
Right.
to bring you the essential knowledge that you need to know to navigate these major sales successfully.
Yes.
And to make it even more interesting, one of the more surprising revelations is that a lot of the concepts that have been taught in sales training for decades, for the last 50, 60 years even.
It's a long time, yeah.
Really stemming from these studies of smaller sales that date back to the 1920s,
Wow.
might actually be counterproductive in today's much more complex sales environment.
Yeah, that's one of the more surprising findings.
So let's start unpacking this. What are some of the key distinctions between these like smaller, simpler sales and the larger, more complex ones that we're talking about?
Yeah, good question. So as you kind of alluded to earlier, most sales books and training programs even today are really built on models that were originally developed for those like low-value single call transactions. And they frequently emphasize things like, building rapport, quickly presenting the benefits of your product or service right away, and then employing techniques aimed at securing the deal right there in that initial conversation.
So like that classic kind of like hard sell approach where you're trying to get that immediate yes.
Exactly.
Got it.
And as we were discussing, that might work perfectly well for, buying a phone case or, like a small impulse purchase.
Right.
But larger sale, they're fundamentally different.
Okay.
They typically involve much longer sales cycles, often with multiple decision makers and influencers within the organization.
Right.
And that creates a much more complex landscape,
Yeah, absolutely.
which demands a completely different set of skills.
Because you're not just dealing with one person's needs and motivations anymore.
Right. You're trying to navigate a whole web of relationships and priorities and often internal politics within that organization.
So it's not just about being a good closer.
No, not at all.
It's about understanding how to manage a much more intricate process.
Right. And spin selling is really focused on that.
So the team at Hathaway that wrote Spin Selling, they specifically focused on these larger sales, right? And they actually went out and observed thousands of real sales interactions.
Yeah, that was a key part of their methodology.
Instead of just relying on existing theories.
They really wanted to see what was actually happening in these larger sales.
Okay.
So they observed over 10,000 salespeople in action across 23 countries.
Wow.
And their emphasis on observing actual behavior in real large sales environments is a big part of what makes their research so valuable.
And they found that salespeople who were trained in these specific research-backed methods
Yeah?
saw on average a 17% greater increase in their sales volume compared to control groups who were not trained.
It's a pretty significant difference.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
It suggests that this is not just theory.
Right.
It actually translates into real, tangible results.
So let's get into some of the specifics here. What did this research reveal about those traditional opening techniques that we've all been taught?
Right? So, the classic advice is to start by trying to build rapport.
Yeah, find some common ground, make some small talk.
Exactly. Try to establish a personal connection.
Right.
And then quickly transition into, like a benefit statement about your product or service.
Yeah, like immediately highlight how you can help them.
Exactly.
I've definitely heard that a lot.
Yeah. And it makes sense in theory.
Right.
The idea is to, capture the buyer's attention early on with that promise of value.
But in these larger sales, it doesn't seem to be as effective.
The research in spin selling suggests that while those opening methods might have some success in, smaller, less complex sales,
Okay.
their effectiveness in larger sales is much more questionable.
I guess in those bigger deals, buyers are probably more focused on the business at hand.
Right. They may see a lot of small talk as a waste of time.
And if you haven't really taken the time to understand their specific needs,
Yeah.
jumping right into a benefit statement,
It can fall flat.
yeah, it might not even resonate with them.
Exactly.
Because you're essentially making assumptions about what they care about.
Right. And those assumptions can often be wrong.
So what about investigating the customer's needs?
Yeah.
That's like another core part of sales training.
Absolutely.
What did they find out about that?
Well, for years and years, sales training has really emphasized the use of open and closed questions as the main tools
Right.
for understanding needs.
Like those open-ended questions to get them talking?
Yeah. Tell me about your current challenges.
Right, and then those more specific closed questions to like confirm details.
Exactly. Are you currently using X system?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So like a very structured approach.
Yeah. It's a classic method that a lot of people have been trained in.
And it seems logical. I remember learning about like the questioning funnel,
Yeah.
where you start with those broad questions and then you narrow it down.
Exactly. A very systematic approach.
But is that really effective in these larger, more complex sales?
Well, the research in spin selling indicates that while those methods might be adequate for smaller transactions,
Okay.
they're not particularly effective when you're dealing with a larger, more complex sale.
I see. So open and closed questions alone, they're not enough to really unlock those big deals?
They can be a starting point, but they need to be part of a more sophisticated approach.
Okay. So if it's not just about those traditional open and closed questions, what is the key to effective needs investigation in these major sales?
We'll definitely get into that in more detail.
Okay, good.
But first, let's talk about the product pitch.
Yeah, because I can imagine that's another area where there's a big difference between a quick sale
Yeah.
and a longer, more involved one.
Absolutely. In a single call sale, a really compelling and enthusiastic product pitch can be very effective.
Right.
You can, generate that excitement, highlight the key features, and potentially close the deal based on that immediate impact.
Yeah. If someone's buying something relatively small and they're impressed by your presentation, they might just go ahead and buy it right then and there.
Exactly.
But in a longer sales cycle, where that decision-making process is spread out over weeks or even months,
Yeah.
that initial enthusiasm from a pitch can fade really quickly.
Oh, it absolutely does.
And they might not even remember half of what you told them.
That's what the research shows.
Right.
Spin selling actually cites a study that was done at an office products company.
Okay.
And they found that less than half of the key points from a product presentation were remembered by the customers just a week later.
That's crazy.
And even more telling is that those customers who initially seemed really eager to buy often lost that enthusiasm within that same time frame if a decision wasn't made right away.
So all that time and effort that you put into crafting the perfect pitch,
Yeah.
it might not have the lasting impact that you think it does in these larger sales.
There's a great anecdote in spin selling that really illustrates this point. It's about a salesperson who's trying to sell a large copying system. And he's got all this product literature. He's really excited about all the features.
He's done his homework.
He's done his homework. He's got all the knowledge.
But it doesn't go well.
But it doesn't close.
Why not?
Because the customer's core concern wasn't about the technical specifications. It was about the value proposition.
Okay.
Did the benefits of this new system really justify the cost?
Right, because if it's a significant investment, they need to see that return.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the customer just didn't perceive enough value no matter how much the salesperson knew about the product.
So product knowledge is important,
Of course.
but it's not enough on its own to win those big deals.
No, especially if you haven't first established the customer's needs and the specific value that you can offer them.
Now let's talk about those first few minutes of a sales call,
Okay.
the preliminaries.
Yeah.
We talked about specific opening techniques, but what about that broader idea that, those first couple of minutes are so crucial for making a good impression?
Right. That classic advice.
You've got to nail that first impression.
Yeah. And while it's definitely important to be, professional and respectful and create a good atmosphere,
Of course.
the research in spin selling suggests that in larger sales, the preliminaries might actually have less influence on the overall success of the sale
Really?
than we traditionally think.
Huh.
Buyers in these larger sales, they're typically more focused on the substance of the discussion.
So they want to get down to business.
They want to understand, what are their problems and how can you potentially help them solve those problems.
So it's not just about making them feel good.
No, it's about demonstrating that you understand their needs and that you have valuable solutions to offer.
Okay, so maybe those first few minutes aren't as make or break as we've been led to believe.
It's still important to be professional and courteous,
Of course.
but don't get too hung up on trying to create that perfect opening.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah?
Now let's move towards the end of the sales process.
All right.
Obtaining commitment.
Yeah.
In smaller sales, that often means closing the deal right there on the spot.
Right. The classic ABC,
Always be closing.
always be closing. Exactly.
So traditional sales training has put a huge emphasis on those closing techniques.
Yeah. All the different closes, the assumptive close, the urgency close, the takeaway close.
Just trying to get that immediate yes.
Exactly.
But what about in these larger sales with those longer sales cycles?
Well, larger sales rarely conclude with that immediate order.
Okay.
Instead, they involve a series of steps,
So it's more of a journey.
right? A series of intermediate steps that move the sale forward.
And spin selling refers to these steps as
They call them advances.
advances. Okay.
So an advance is essentially an agreement from the customer to take a specific action that moves the sale to the next stage.
Got it. So it could be something like, agreeing to a product demonstration or a pilot project.
Exactly. Or maybe a meeting with a higher level decision maker.
Okay, so it's about making incremental progress rather than trying to go for the big close right away.
Yeah.
And what did the research actually find about those traditional closing techniques in this context?
Well, what they found is that those closing techniques that might be effective in those smaller,
Right.
more transactional sales,
Right.
they're often ineffective or even counterproductive in those larger, more complex sales.
Really? So all that training on how to close,
Yeah.
it might actually be doing more harm than good.
Well, at least in those larger sales.
Wow. That goes against a lot of the conventional wisdom.
It does. And it was a surprising finding even for the researchers.
Do you have some examples from spin selling that illustrate this?
Sure. So in one of their early studies, they looked at 190 sales calls in an office equipment company.
Okay.
And they compared the 30 calls where the salespeople used the most closing techniques with the 30 calls where they used the least.
So like the high pressure closers versus the more low key ones.
Right. And the result was that only 11 of the high close calls actually resulted in a sale,
Okay.
compared to 21 of the low close calls.
So the people who didn't push as hard to close were actually more successful.
Almost twice as successful.
Wow.
And in another study with 47 sellers across 86 calls, they found a negative relationship between increased closing and actual sales success.
So even though these salespeople were using more closing techniques after being trained,
Who they were.
fewer of their calls were actually successful.
Exactly.
So the training was effective in teaching the techniques,
They're what?
but the techniques themselves weren't helping.
They were actually hurting their chances of closing those larger deals.
So why is that? Why are these closing techniques that work so well in small sales so ineffective in large sales?
Well, I think part of it has to do with the psychology of pressure.
Okay.
For very small decisions, a bit of pressure might nudge someone to say yes,
Right.
just to kind of avoid further discussion or get it over with.
Right. If it's a low stakes decision and they're not really sure what to do.
Yeah, exactly. But with larger, more significant decisions, people generally react negatively to feeling pressured.
Because there's more at stake.
Exactly. They need to feel confident and comfortable with their decision.
So it's almost like that classic dating analogy.
I was just thinking that,
Mm-hmm.
if you ask someone out on a date and you're too pushy or aggressive,
Right.
it's probably going to backfire.
But if it's a low-stakes request...
Yeah, like, hey, do you want to grab a coffee sometime?
Right.
That might work with a little bit of a nudge.
Okay, so the level of pressure needs to be appropriate to the size of the decision.
Exactly.
And they actually did a study on this, right?
They did. They looked at the relationship between closing techniques and the size of the decision.
And what did they find?
They found that closing training actually increased success rates for those low-value items.
Okay.
So it did shorten the transaction times, and it did increase the number of closes.
Okay.
But when they looked at those higher-value goods,
Yeah.
while the transaction times did shorten and the use of closing techniques did increase, the overall success rate actually remained lower.
So it didn't have the same positive impact?
It didn't. And the researchers actually mentioned in spin selling that they were initially hesitant to even share these findings.
Really? Why is that?
Because the belief in closing is so deeply ingrained in the sales world.
It's like the holy grail of sales.
It is. It's been taught for decades.
Always be closing.
Exactly. So to suggest that it might not be universally effective,
Yeah.
it was almost heresy.
I can imagine.
But the data was very clear.
So what's the takeaway here about closing?
Well, the key takeaway is that those traditional closing techniques, they can work in those smaller sales
Right.
where you're dealing with less sophisticated customers, and there's no real need for a long-term relationship.
It's transactional.
It is. But for those larger high-value sales where you're trying to build trust and establish a long-term relationship,
Yeah.
those pressure-based closing techniques can actually be detrimental.
So if you're not supposed to close, then what are you supposed to do at the end of a call?
Well, you still need to obtain commitment,
Of course.
but it needs to be the right kind of commitment.
Okay.
And it starts with setting the right objectives for each call.
So not just aiming for the order?
Right, because in a simple sale, it's often just order or no sale.
Right.
But in a major sale, it's a much longer, more gradual process.
Yeah, you might be working with a customer for months or even years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So their initial definition of closing success, which was simply based on meeting your objectives for the call,
Okay.
it proved to be flawed
Why is that?
because salespeople would just rationalize any outcome.
Give me an example.
There's a great example in spin selling about a sales rep in New York City
Okay.
who claimed that he intentionally got himself thrown out of a meeting with a potential customer.
He got himself kicked out on
Like,
purpose.
He said he did it because he thought the customer was a credit risk.
So he was just making excuses.
He was rationalizing his failure.
Wow.
So they needed a better way to define closing success.
Okay.
And they came up with this distinction between advances and continuations.
Okay, so what's an advance?
An advance is a specific action that the customer agrees to take
Okay.
that moves the sale forward.
So like a concrete step.
Exactly. Something tangible that you can measure.
Got it.
And a continuation, on the other hand, is more of a non-committal statement.
Give me an example.
So it could be something like, we're very impressed with your presentation, or
Okay.
we'll definitely keep you in mind.
So it sounds positive,
It does.
but there's no real commitment there.
There's no action.
So those continuations, they're basically unsuccessful closures.
According to spin selling, yes.
Okay. And there's an example in the book about this, right?
There is. It's about a sales rep named John C.,
Okay.
who thought he'd closed the deal because the customer gave him some really positive feedback.
Okay.
But he had actually only achieved a continuation.
Because he didn't get them to agree to a specific next step.
Exactly. His manager thought he was a weak closer
Right.
and that he needed to work on his closing technique.
But that wasn't the real problem.
No. The real problem was that his call objectives were unclear.
Okay.
He hadn't focused on getting an advance.
So what's the advice here?
The advice is to always include objectives in your call planning that are designed to get a specific action from the customer.
An advance.
Exactly.
So instead of just asking for the order,
Right.
you should be suggesting an appropriate next step.
Yes, something that's concrete and measurable and moves the sale forward.
That makes sense. It's about guiding them through a process.
It is.
Now let's go back to the middle of the sales process.
Okay.
Investigating the customer's needs.
Yes.
We talked about this earlier, but how important is it really in those larger sales?
It's crucial.
More important than closing.
According to the research in spin selling, yes.
Really?
The investigating stage has the single strongest influence on the overall success of a sales call in a major sale.
So even more than the opening or the presentation or the close?
Yes.
Wow.
And the salespeople who were most effective at investigating needs were consistently the top performers overall.
So questioning and listening skills are really key here.
They're absolutely essential.
I guess if you don't understand the customer's needs,
Right.
you can't really offer them a solution that's going to be valuable to them.
And poor investigating skills can make you seem weak later in the call,
Okay.
especially when you're trying to demonstrate your capability and obtain commitment.
And what's interesting is that a lot of salespeople who were labeled as weak closers
Yeah.
often turned out to be primarily unskilled in the investigating stage.
They just weren't good at uncovering and developing needs.
So the problem wasn't their closing technique.
No.
It was their ability to understand the customer.
Exactly.
Okay, so needs in major sales, they don't just magically appear.
No. They need to be developed.
And that takes time.
It does.
Absolutely.
And it's a key difference from those smaller sales,
Right.
where the need is often very immediate.
Like an impulse purchase.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You see something, you buy it.
But these larger sales are much more considered and often involve multiple people.
And the consequences of a bad purchase can be much greater.
Yeah, it's not just about buying a gadget.
No, you could be talking about, a major investment that affects an entire department or even the whole company.
So as the sale gets larger, the needs take longer to develop.
Yeah, and they involve more people.
And how does spin selling define a need?
They define it as any statement made by the buyer which expresses a want or concern that can be satisfied by the seller.
Okay, so it's pretty broad.
It is.
It's not just about those, objective requirements.
No, they found that trying to rigidly distinguish between needs and wants
Okay.
wasn't particularly helpful.
So it's really about anything the buyer expresses that suggests a potential opportunity for you to help them.
Exactly.
And needs typically develop in stages, right?
They do.
So how does that work?
Well, they often start with just minor imperfections or slight dissatisfaction with the current situation.
Okay.
Then those can evolve into clearer problems, difficulties, or dissatisfactions.
And finally, they might become explicit wants or desires or intentions to act.
Exactly.
So it's a progression.
It is.
And the key difference in larger sales is that this whole process takes much longer.
Much longer.
Okay, so we're tracking the development of a need. And you mentioned two types of needs, implied and explicit.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
So implied needs are statements of problems, difficulties, or dissatisfactions,
Okay,
but they're not yet fully developed.
so they're more like hints of problems.
Exactly. Give me an example.
So an implied need might be something like, our current system is too slow, or
Okay.
we're having trouble keeping up with demand.
Okay, so it's a statement of a problem,
It is.
but it doesn't explicitly state what they need to solve it.
Exactly.
And then what's an explicit need?
An explicit need is a clear statement of a want or desire that your product or service can satisfy.
Okay, so it's much more specific.
It is.
Give me an example.
So an explicit need might be something like, we need a system that can process data twice as fast, or
We need to increase our production capacity by 20%.
so they're stating their desired outcome.
Exactly.
Okay, and what's the difference between implied and explicit needs in terms of their impact on a sale?
Well, in smaller sales, implied needs can often be a good predictor of success.
Okay.
The more problems you uncover,
Yeah.
the more likely you are to make a sale.
Because you're showing them that you understand their challenges. But in larger sales, it's
Yeah.
not as simple.
No, the research actually shows that in larger sales, there's no direct relationship between the number of implied needs you uncover and the success of the call.
So just having a long list of problems isn't enough.
It's not.
You need to do something with those implied needs.
You need to develop them into explicit needs.
So how do you do that?
Well, that's where the SPIN questioning strategy comes in.
Okay, let's talk about SPIN.
SPIN is an acronym that stands for Situation, Problem, Implication, and Need-Payoff questions.
Okay.
And it's a framework for asking effective questions in those larger sales.
So it's a way to guide the customer through that process of developing their needs, from
Yeah.
implied to explicit.
Yes.
Okay, let's break down each type of questions, starting with situation questions.
All right, so situation questions are those basic fact-finding questions about the buyer's current situation.
Okay.
Things like, what kind of business are you in? How many employees do you have? What systems are you currently using? That kind of thing.
So just getting a basic understanding of their context?
Exactly. And these questions are important,
Okay.
but you don't want to ask too many of them
Why is that?
because they can make the buyer feel like they're being interrogated.
Right.
And they can also make you seem unprepared,
Okay.
like you haven't done your homework.
So how many situation questions is too many?
Well, the research in spin selling found that experienced salespeople tend to ask fewer situation questions than those who are newer to sales.
Okay, so the more experienced you are,
Yeah.
the better you are at qualifying the customer up front. So you don't need to ask as many of those basic questions.
Right.
Okay, so what about problem questions?
Problem questions are those questions that focus on the buyer's problems, difficulties, or dissatisfactions.
So you're starting to dig into those pain points.
Exactly.
Give me some examples.
So problem questions might be something like, are you having any trouble keeping up with demand? Or
Okay.
is your current system reliable? Or are you experiencing any bottlenecks in your workflow?
Okay, so you're moving from just the facts to the actual issues that they're facing.
Yes, and these problem questions, they're more effective than situation questions
Okay.
because they start to uncover those needs that your product or service might be able to address.
So you're identifying those potential opportunities.
Exactly.
And experienced salespeople tend to ask more problem questions
They do.
because they know that's where the real value lies.
But in larger sales, just stopping at problem questions isn't enough.
Okay, so what's the next level?
The next level is implication questions.
Implication questions. Okay, what are those?
So implication questions are those questions that explore the effects or consequences of the buyer's problems.
Okay.
So you're not just highlighting the problem itself,
Right.
but you're also digging into the repercussions of that problem.
So like the ripple effects?
Exactly.
Hmm.
You know, the hidden costs, the lost opportunities, the potential risks.
Give me an example.
So let's say the customer has told you that they're having trouble keeping up with demand.
Okay.
An implication question might be, what impact is that having on your customer satisfaction levels? Or how is that affecting your ability to meet your revenue targets?
So you're helping them to see the bigger picture.
You're helping them to understand the true seriousness and urgency of their problems.
Oh.
And that's really important in larger sales
Why is that?
because you need to create a strong justification for them to make a significant investment.
So you're building the case for your solution.
Exactly.
And there's a good example in spin selling about this, right?
There is. It's about a company that sells those contortomat machines. And the salesperson starts by uncovering a seemingly small problem.
Okay.
But through a series of well-crafted implication questions,
Yeah.
he builds that problem up into a major one.
And ultimately justifies a much larger investment.
Exactly.
And even in that example about buying a car,
Yeah.
those questions about depreciation and potential breakdowns,
Right.
those were essentially implication questions,
They were.
highlighting the hidden costs of sticking with the old car.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that a lot of professionals who are in those like diagnostic roles,
Okay.
you know, like doctors or consultants,
Yeah.
they naturally ask those kinds of implication questions.
Even if they're not thinking of it as a sales technique.
Right. It's just part of their process of understanding the situation.
So situation questions to understand the context.
Yeah.
Problem questions to uncover dissatisfaction.
Right.
Implication questions to magnify the seriousness of the problem.
Exactly.
And then what's the final piece of the spin-on model?
The final piece is need-payoff questions.
Need-payoff. Okay, what are those all about?
So need-payoff questions shift the focus to solutions and benefits.
Okay.
Instead of you telling the customer about how great your product is,
Right.
you get them to articulate the positive outcomes they would achieve by solving the problem.
So you're getting them to sell themselves on the solution.
In a way, yes.
Give me some examples.
So need-payoff questions might be something like, would it be helpful to reduce your downtime by 15%? Or
Okay.
if you could streamline your workflow,
Yeah.
how would that impact your overall productivity?
So you're guiding them to think about the positive results. And the research shows that.